So last night was Thursday Night Football. It was a heck of a game. 34-31. The Lions beat the Packers on a walk-off field goal. It was fun to watch that one last night. Both of those are legit playoff teams. The Lions hold the 1 seed in the NFC. The Packers, everyone's takeaway from last night, it seems like, you look Twitter, you were talking about it earlier. The Packers look like a real threat.
They're legit.
They look legit.
When you got Jordan Love under center, you're going to be always have a shot. But their defense, even though they gave up 34 last night, impressed with that. I think when it gets cold, they'll be able to run the ball. They're in that A-tier team in the conference. Like, they're in that top tier in the conference.
So we were talking off air. Mm-hmm. What kind of tier do you find Washington in, and how much of a chance would you give them if they were to face one of these teams in the playoffs? So just to give you some context right now, where they sit, they are the 7 seed in the NFC at 8-5. There's 3 teams currently behind them at 6-6, the Rams, Cardinals, and Buccaneers. So regardless of what happens this week, they'll still be in a playoff spot going into next week. But now the intriguing spot is they're 8-5. The Packers are 9-4. There's a potential that maybe you could leapfrog the Packers. But if you stay at the 7 seed, you're going to face either Philadelphia or Detroit, and you're going to face them on the road. And that's a big deal for Detroit, especially because if you have to go to Detroit, that's going to be a problem. So if you face one of those teams, we'll talk about that in a second. Maybe you could beat Seattle. If you get up to that 6 seed, you're going to play either the Seahawks or whoever wins the West or whoever wins the South with the Falcons or the Buccaneers. And I think those teams would be competitive. But I'm curious, coming out of last night, Lynell, how do you feel about Washington's chances if they're able to get into the playoffs of not just being one and done and losing in the wild card round and calling it a good season and being hopeful for the future, but actually winning a playoff game when they get into January?
Yeah, it's tough. Love this group as much as anybody does, right? But realistically, how could you sit there and say that you're comfortable with them beating a Philly, a Detroit, a Green Bay? Like, those to me are like the top tier in the NFC. If they're somehow able to catch Green Bay, which is actually a little bit more realistic than maybe we're given a chance for, Green Bay finishes up at Seattle, home for New Orleans, at Minnesota, and then home for Chicago to wrap up the regular season. We know Washington's Final Four: New Orleans, Philly, Atlanta, Dallas. I think Washington's got the easier schedule, which would give them a shot to leapfrog them, but that would put them in a spot where they're taking on probably the winner of the West or the winner of the South. I think those two divisions, Washington can hang with anybody. And I know in week 1 against Tampa, you got bludgeoned, but it's week 1. You're a much, much better football team than you were then. You have an identity of who you are, and you know who you want to be, and you're better at every spot. But, like, those would kind of be the teams that I would give Washington a shot against. I really don't think they can go on the road and beat Detroit, if we're being realistic. I really don't think they can go on the road and beat Philadelphia, if we're being realistic. I would – the Seattle thing, the West is interesting, right? I think from a matchup standpoint, you probably would want to play Arizona. I don't know if you can go up to Seattle and beat – that's a tough-ass place to play, for one. And think about how much no-huddle Washington runs, and the communication aspect of their offense, to me, probably gets ruined in a playoff scenario at Seattle. It probably limits some of what you could do from the hurry-up standpoint. But even if it was a neutral venue, like, they can run the football, and they have multiple receivers on the – we don't match up well with Seattle at all.
No.
In my opinion.
No.
So I would make it Seattle, Philly, Green Bay, Detroit. Can't beat them, in my opinion.
I think they can stick with, like the teams you were saying, I think they can stick with whoever gets that 3 and 4 seed.
Yes. Yeah.
I think they could beat Philly, but that's just a division thing, right? That's facing them a third time. If they have to face Detroit, you can probably just go ahead and mail it in. Like, I don't think that's going to happen. But if you were to have to face Detroit, I don't think you're going to be able to go in there and win that ball game.
Probably not.
I think you could maybe keep it close for a little bit, but the other point is it's a playoff game. There's not going to be any fooling around. They're going to be so buttoned up. Like, there's going to be nothing that is – they're going to be ready to roll. So the reason I think that they would have a shot against just about anybody with the exception of Detroit, I would say not Philly.
You have a shot, sure. I mean, anybody can win any game.
Sure, but the reason that I say, like, I don't see them. If you weren't in the NFC East with Philadelphia, I probably wouldn't give them a shot. But they know Philly. They're going to face them twice before if they were to face them in the playoffs. So they'd have some familiarity there. We know how
to play devil's advocate though too. Philly also gets to prepare for you 3 times as well. So that's the thing I'm more so worried about.
Yeah, and I get that, but at the same point, you know how tough it is to beat a team 3 times, and we'll see what happens when they face them a second time. But I probably wouldn't give them much of a chance against either of those teams if Philly wasn't a part of the division. But the reason that I have some belief that they could do it is I think the offense can score against anyone. And if you can go out there and do what they've done for a majority of the season, where you have long, sustained drives and you take care of the football and it's efficiency over explosive plays like we talked about yesterday, where it's nothing sexy. There's no 70-yard bomb to Terry McLaurin. You'd love to have that involved, but more likely than not, it's just 4 and 5 yards a pop, and you limit the possessions. I think that's the way to win. But we also talked about this a little bit yesterday as well. This team parallels a little bit of what Miami did last year, where Miami was a good football team, and we talked a little bit off air about the weather element. You know, that played into it, obviously, when they got into the playoffs. But I don't think that's necessarily as much for Washington, as they've taken care of business against the bad teams. They've got a couple more bad teams on their schedule. You know, if they just take care of bad teams, they'll get to 10 wins, right? They'll beat New Orleans, hopefully. You've got Dallas again. Hopefully they take care of business this time. That's at 10 wins. Can you do well against a Atlanta team? Can you do well against a Philly team for the second time? But realistically, how many teams with good records have they beaten? They've beaten Arizona, which that looks like a decent win in terms of where they're at in the standings. Also, they dominated Arizona. The Cincinnati win looks good, but Cincinnati also looks terrible. Like, their defense can't stop anybody. They didn't stop Washington at all in week 3. I mean, what's their impressive win? Chicago,
they don't have one.
Chicago at the point of when they played them was decent, but
they had a winning record. It's their only win against a team with a winning record entering the contest. I just think straight up, and you only play who the schedule makers put out in front of you. So it's not,
I agree,
to discredit Washington at all. Right. It's just the fact of the matter of the situation. They do not have a signature win under their belt to this point. So,
and that's why, like, look,
let's just call it what it is.
We're not criticizing them because they've taken care of business in most of their games that they need to. I'm not criticizing them at all. I'm just saying, when you get into January football, am I confident that you're going to be able to beat, say you get to that 6th seed? Are you going to beat Seattle? I would think that you could. But are you for sure going to? I don't know. Are you going to be able to beat? We're going to get to see them against Atlanta in a couple weeks. Are they going to be able to beat Atlanta in the playoffs? Could you beat Tampa if they got there? We know they could beat Arizona if the Rams were to get there. Can you beat these teams? I think they're in the conversation, but I'm not 100% sold that they can. And then, in all likelihood, if you end up as the 7 seed when you're facing a Philly or Detroit, can you go to their house and get it done? And I just don't know that they're there yet. And by the way, there's nothing wrong with that.
No, that's what I'm saying.
So, like, we're not trying to bash them or anything.
It's being real.
But, yeah, it's just being real. Like,
straight up.
They can win, though, because the same reason we talked about with the Packers with Jordan Love.
Exactly. You got 5.
You've got 5.
I give you that.
Daniels.
I give you that. But, like, you can say that about – that's the special thing of hitting on the quarterback. So I cannot take that away from them. I just think for me, they're just in that second tier in the conference. Like, it's them, Minnesota, Atlanta, NFC West winner.
Well, and you can probably put Minnesota above Washington because of their record.
I mean,
I know how they haven't looked impressive.
I think they're the type of team Washington can get, though. All you got to do is you find if you're able to craft up a good protection plan against Minnesota, you're fine, because they're going to blitz the hell out of you.
Well, they're going to do a lot of stuff. But Minnesota's an enigma.
They're a fraud. I think Minnesota's a fraud.
I don't know that they're a fraud as much as they're just so unique. Brian Flores does a lot of stuff that really no one else in the league is doing defensively. Their offense is really efficient at times with Sam Darnold, and then sometimes Sam Darnold looks like Sam Darnold.
Right, and that's my thing. I don't trust the quarterback at all in a big-time, gotta-have-it situation. I just don't.